So yesterday we learned the 5 properties of a basic parallelogram. Now there are some special parallelograms, all right? Because remember the definition was that just that the opposite sides have to be parallel. That's what makes a shape a parallelogram. All right. We have rectangles, rhombuses, and squares. So we're going to talk about those 3 special parallelograms today. All right, so a rectangle. A rectangle is, by definition, a parallelogram that has 4 congruent angles. So, first of all, it has then all 5 properties that a parallelogram has, right? Which was, right, that opposite sides are parallel, opposite sides are congruent, opposite angles are congruent, your consecutive angles will be supplementary, and the diagonals, all right, which I'll draw in a minute. Well, actually, I'll use this picture, bisect each other. So those 5 properties still hold true in every rectangle. But in addition to that, not only are the opposite angles congruent, but all 4 of them are, which means if we take 360, which is the sum of a quadrilateral, and divide it evenly by 4, I'm going to turn all these arcs into right angles. All right, so they will always be 90 degrees. The other thing that happens is not only do the diagonals bisect each other, but they are congruent. So I'm going to make that now a double, so it shows all 4 parts. And the reason that that happens is because with a rectangle, we're straightening up the corners. And so when we do that, we no longer have a longer and a shorter diagonal, but the 2 will be the same length. Okay. If you want to pause the video now, there's a worksheet strictly on rectangles and properties of rectangles. So go complete that worksheet at this time. And then come back. I'm going to continue with a rhombus. All right, a rhombus is also a parallelogram, but it has 4 congruent sides. So again, it has all 5 properties of a parallelogram. Opposite sides are parallel. Opposite sides are congruent. Opposite angles are congruent. Consecutive ones will be supplementary. And again, the diagonals bisect each other. All right. But in addition to that, it has all 4 sides congruent. So I'm going to just add and put double tick marks all the way around. All right. Because not only are the opposite ones congruent, but now all 4 will be. The diagonals are perpendicular. So what happens is we create 4 small right triangles within our rhombus. And then the last one is that the diagonals bisect the angles. All right, so we already know that opposite angles are congruent, but when we draw on a diagonal and a rhombus, then we get 4 smaller congruent angles. And the same thing happens this way. So that side and this side will be the same. All right, so a lot of fun things happen in a rhombus. Okay. I always think of a rhombus as a lopsided square because the 4 sides are congruent. When we straighten up a rhombus and make the 4 angles right angles, like in a rectangle, right, then what happens is a square has all the properties of a basic parallelogram, a rectangle, and a rhombus. All right, so we know that it's a parallelogram with 4 congruent sides and 4 congruent angles. All right, so we've got all 5 properties of a parallelogram. I'm not going to draw them this time. Our picture is going to get extremely busy, but I do know that all 4 angles are congruent, which means they would all be 90 degrees. All 4 sides are congruent. The diagonals are congruent. So just like in a rectangle, all 4 of these parts will be the same. They're also perpendicular. And as we learned before when we were doing 45, 45, 90, we're going to have these isosceles right triangles. Okay. So when we bisect the angles, these have to be all 45. And that only happens in a square, not just a rhombus, but a square. Okay. So I guess you could say the square is most special. It's got all the properties. All right. So today you've got a worksheet just on rectangles, as I said earlier. And then there's a second worksheet on rhombus and squares. And of course, it says rhombi because that really is plural for rhombus. All right. So you have properties of rhombi and properties of squares to work on. Let me know if you have any questions.